Hope podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Vazquez, and I have the incredible opportunity again to have back on the show the youth pastor at my local church here in Delaware, Pastor Lucas Stearns, to continue our conversation that we previously had. So, Lucas, thank you so much for jumping on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm just happy to be here. So
Of course, yeah. Well, we have a lot to go through.
we do. We do.
Last time, for our listeners, if you want to check out the part one of our conversation, you could look at it. It's already been released. It's with Pastor Lucas as well, and I believe it's titled "The Spiritual State of the Next Generation."
Yeah.
Now, for those who don't want to go back, because there's going to be
Right.
some that don't want to do that, Lucas, do you want to just give a quick overview of what we discussed and what we ended on?
Yeah, because that's what I'm real good at is being brief. And so I'm going to do my best here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So hey, if maybe you are just tuning in for part two, and you're like, I'm not going all the way back to watch all of part one to jump back in. We really talked about just different things that happen in different times affect the way that different generations of people not only view the world around them. So we talked a lot about worldview and how did we get to this point? How do we get to this worldview? Why do a lot of the older generations have the worldview they do? Why does our generation have the worldview it does? And how does the younger generation, how do they adopt and acquire the worldview that they have? And at the end of the day, what do we do with it? Because a lot of the things that have happened in life have shaped and formed what they believe, how they act, their behavior, and just their values. And a lot of that comes from the world around them and the things in life that have happened that affect them. And different generations learn and perceive things differently, and so that helps us, and it can also be hurtful to us. Of how do we present the gospel to them? What are going to naturally be the challenges that different generations run into when looking at the gospel and looking at the Bible and looking at theology, and just what are going to be the hangups because of the things that have happened around them in the world. And so we were able to talk a lot about where does Gen Z fall in? Where does even Gen Alpha begin to fall in their worldview? And what are some of the hangups and some of the things? And I don't want to jump the gun. I know that we've got a few things we want to talk about with what do we believe about the next generation? What are some of their biggest hangups? And those can be things we get into and things that we can talk about. What do we do about it? But last week we were really able to talk about how did we get to this point? What is it that they believe? What are some of their biggest hangups? What are some of their biggest strong points? And how can we, as the church, as the Big C church, not just our church, but as the church, handle and tackle the next generation, and to be able to love them well, to meet them where they're at, to speak to them on their level, and really to be able to steward them, because they are the next generation of the church, and they're the generation that we're already beginning to see lead and take over and be a part of the church. And if they are going to be the church of tomorrow, then we need to foster them well today. So yeah.
So good. I think that was a great job. You did great summarizing an hour's worth of content.
What was my time? What was it, 2 minutes or
That
something?
was you're good at elevator pitches. I think that's a skill.
Been working. I practiced that 25 times before we started.
Well, you did a great job, and I think it's an important conversation, right? Because
Right.
you said it. It's the next generation. It's the next people coming up in the church. It's the next teachers, the next pastors, and whoever they end up being will lead another group of people. And if they lead poorly, we're going to have this whole problem all over again. And like you mentioned, we're going to keep it. It's just about we don't want to blow ourselves out of proportion here, right? We don't want to solve the problem because we know that's kind of a lot to handle in one conversation in an hour or so.
Yeah.
But we do want to just focus on some call to actions. What can we do as a church, both locally and as a wider at the capital C church, Big C church, to solve these issues and keep the youth in the church with a biblical worldview?
Yeah.
So in order to keep us a little focused here on point, I want to read off what our boy Dr. George Barna, who
Yeah.
we focused on last time, that's our boy, what he reported on back in 2011. He reported that 3 in 5 young people leave the church. I don't know how accurate that still is, but I do think the reasons he gave for why they left are relevant. I don't have the data for that, but I have a really good feeling it's still relevant. I actually think it's increased. It's even more so for these
Yeah.
reasons. And let me just list these reasons. The first one is isolationism. So you have these kids feeling isolated from the world, no technology, no TV because of their faith.
Mhm.
Shallowness, they feel that Bible teaching is unclear or they're uninterested. Anti-science, they feel that science and faith are incompatible. And as a Christian scientist myself, I disagree, but that's a whole other conversation we could have.
I'm not the
Sex,
expert on that one.
yeah, sex. The kids feel that the church is too simplistic and judgmental when it comes to sex. Exclusivity, they feel that the church is too exclusive. And then doubters, and this hit me the hardest, that they feel that the church is not a safe place to express their doubts. And if that is a result of a failed church, of a failed older generation, I don't know what is, if that's
Right.
not it.
Right.
So these are some reasons that they give. Now, what do you make of these 6 reasons? Do any stand out in particular? And it's a 3-part question here, so I could
Right.
reiterate this.
Go ahead,
And
real quick. Reread those back to me. I want to be able to get them all in front of me where I can see them.
sure, yeah, isolationism is the first one. So
Isolation.
they feel isolated from the world. Shallowness. So the kids, they feel that Bible teaching is unclear, or they're uninterested. Anti-science. Kids feel that science and faith are incompatible. Um, Sex. They feel the church is too judgmental and simplistic regarding sex. And then doubters. They feel that the church is not a safe place to express their doubts. So those are the 6 reasons. So my question was, what do you make of these reasons? Do any stand out in particular? I don't expect you to go through all of them. I would like to have a whole discussion on all of them, but if
Yeah.
any stand out to you, and then how do you think the church can address this in the short term?
Yeah, I think I'll say this. I agree. I think these are all still things that are, um, you know, things that are students run into. You know what I mean? Or that students feel like they can't talk about, or that they're things that are unclear, or that they maybe just disagree with, or that we as the church have handled wrong, or just done a bad job of stewarding these topics with them. Um, and it's caused them to kind of turn away.
Right.
Uh, I would say the 2 things for me that kind of stick out are the doubt piece. You know, and we talked very briefly last week that was 2 things. That was something for both of us. Even growing up, that was a big thing for us, and I don't think that's any coincidence. You know what I mean? That
Right.
you're going to see a majority of people, or that in any room of people you get in, you're probably going to find that people have run into that at some point or another, and it can be a big stumbling block for a lot of people.
Right.
Another one is the sex and even sexuality thing is that it's the church is judgmental against this or that or whatever, and I think really we've just and you know as I look at these things, I really do think it's just that we have handled the conversation wrong. There's a
Mm,
lot of taboo subjects, or so to speak, taboo subjects, or things where it's like we didn't talk about that growing up in church, or like we didn't preach about that, or whatever it might be, or it was unclear the way that it was talked about, and the way that we approached it. You know, we teach it wrong, and if they learn it wrong, then they're living it wrong, and that's not on them. That's on us as imparters of the word to a young generation who's just trying to learn what's best, what's right, what's up, what's down, and they're navigating this and figuring it out, and especially as we talked with the way that Gen Z takes things is that if you disagree with their behavior or their thoughts, then they take that as their identity and you're attacking them. And so, we
right.
even just jumping into that is like, I could see where this becomes an even more um, uh, perpetuated thing, or it becomes more um, of the focal point of, well, if you disagree with this, or if I it doesn't sit right with me, then I'm out, then I'm gone. And so it becomes an equally dangerous thing. But I think those are absolutely still things. And I agree with you on the anti-science thing too. Is um, you know yeah, it's a different conversation for a different day. But just because the Bible doesn't mention oxygen does not mean that's what we're breathing. You know what I mean? Like, that's not what we're breathing. Like, you know,
Yeah.
that's a different conversation for a different day. But yeah,
But to that point, I think it is worth unpacking slightly because,
mhm,
and I've had so many, I teach the youth group
yeah,
at our church, and so many people, students come up to me and they're like, "Hey, I'm learning evolution, and it's all against the faith.
right.
What do I do? Like, do I debate with my teacher? Do I respect my teacher?"
Drop out of
Some
this
of
class.
them,
Yeah.
Yeah, some of them are teachers, and they're like, "Do I respect the curriculum? Do I go against the so they're put in a really tough spot. So I'm not surprised it's there. But to your point, it's easily reconcilable. I think the issue is, do we teach that to them? And that goes along with your point exactly. Have we been doing this wrong and handling these conversations poorly?
Yeah. I mean, I know in my life there's been conversations that I can just honestly say I haven't handled perfectly. You know what I mean? Like
Of course, yeah.
when it comes to the sex and sexuality things, it's like there have been conversations that I've handled less than well, or things that I have pushed off, or moments where I've not said what I feel like I should have said or needed to say completely. You know what I mean? Just out of like this thing of like, hey, it gets real awkward, or hey, I don't really know how to say this to a sixth grader.
Right.
But I've kind of learned over time of like, don't sacrifice the truth in the name of comfortability or kindness. And so I think that's something that we've also done too. And I think, and I was going to talk about this a little later, and we may get into it later as well. But I think the church over time has been really good at telling people everything that we're against, and not everything that we're for. And going back to, I think that this sex conversation is just, it's a big one with the generation, because they're very, especially middle school, high schoolers, they're very full of self, and they're like, well, I want to do what I want to do, and that sounds like a whole lot of fun. So can I, like, I don't see what the problem is here. Like, it becomes that whole thing, especially because of the world around them has glorified it and pushed it to the forefront of topical conversation, and has told them that if they're not doing it and they're not involved with this, then what's wrong with them? You know what I mean? And so
Right.
we have to be just as at the forefront of that conversation of saying, hey, it's a great thing. It's something that God designed. It's something God designed for your benefit. But we just put that asterisk on there of, but there's a right way to do it. There's a way to do it inside of God's best. And it's not at this time in your life, and it's not like this, and it's not in this way. And so, but I think for so long we've taught students, the bar ends with like, don't do this. Stop doing this. This is wrong. It's bad. And so, we throw the baby out with the bathwater. When the reality is that's not the case. It's just outside of the context of where they're at in their life, and the context of how they go about it. But teaching them that it is a good thing, it is a great thing, it's something God designed for us in the right context. We miss the other part.
Right.
Um, and so I think that's one of them. But I think you could apply that same thing with all of these different things. And it's actually funny you bring this up, is the hey, teachings are unclear, and sometimes I feel like it's just the sermons are the same. I was talking to some students earlier, and they were like, yeah, I feel like you preach the same thing every week. And I started going back and looking at my like notes, and I was like, do I preach the same thing every week? I was like, I haven't preached the same Bible verse in months, but I don't even know. Like, I was like, but it's just funny the way that sometimes they end up hearing the same thing.
Right.
And for me, that's a good like gauge for me of, hey, do I need to begin to maybe lay it on? Maybe there's things that I haven't been talking about that I need to start talking about. Maybe there's things that I've been talking too much about that students are just like, hey, we're done hearing that, and we're drowning that out now. So it's good for me even to hear those kinds of things sometimes, because it's a gauge for, are we approaching this correctly or are we not?
Well,
We
good for
don't.
you for reflecting, because I
Yeah,
think that's the hardest part, right? Pride could come in and you could say, "Oh, well, no, I don't. What do
yeah.
you know? You're just a student." And that's exactly what got us in this
Well,
position,
and I
right?
wish and I wish I could say that that wasn't my first reaction, but
Yeah.
it did make me go back and think. I was like, have I been? And even though maybe my content isn't the same, and maybe to me the topics that I'm building out and things I'm talking about, and my points every week, like I look at them and I'm like, these are completely different things. But I do have to start to reflect and go, what are my students hearing that they feel like it's the same thing every week? Um,
Right.
and so, being able to look at it and say, okay, is there a different approach? Is there something that they're wanting that I'm not giving them? Is there something that they're longing to have truth for that I'm not able to give them the application for, because I don't know what it is they're looking for? So, just being in tune with those kinds of things, because I don't want to fall into the category where I'm saying, hey, my messages are shallow, and the things that they hear every week that I want to be guidance for their life is they don't feel it's applicable to their
Right.
situation. And so that kind of thing. But I mean, even now, even in my position where every day, every week I work with students, I don't ever want to become blind to the fact that that could be me. So
Well, that's good. And that's the humility that I think we need, because then we allow God to teach us, who's our ultimate teacher, to then teach others, right? And When I'm looking through these 6 reasons, I think of especially the shallowness one, where kids feel Bible teaching is unclear or uninteresting.
Mhm.
Not that your teaching is, but I think maybe they do that because they're so focused on the entertainment. And
Mhm.
this was not my idea. This is back to I don't know if you heard of Tim Barnett of Stand to Reason. He's an apologist. He's actually really good with the youth. He makes some really good like Instagram videos playing over other people's videos. And his idea was it's shallow because we focus so much on entertainment, but we lose the theological aspect of it. And I thought that was so good because, I mean, obviously, entertainment, there's a place for it, right? It brings
Right.
people in the door. You want to play games. Like, kids don't want to walk in a wooden church with suit and ties. Like, that's not going to bring them there as much as we might
Which
wish.
I have. I know. We were talking about kind of some topics of conversation. I'll get there. Don't you worry.
Okay, good. But that's, that's one of the things that came to mind. And then the other thing I wanted to briefly mention before I go on to a different question for you is, um, when I look at these 6 reasons, the first thing that jumps to my mind, given my background, is apologetics solves all of these issues, like right off the bat. And that's why apologetics, as we talked about last time, is so useful for the church. I don't want to say the word necessary, but useful for the church. And I do want to
You feel like you can't say necessary because it's your world. I'll say necessary. I'll say it's necessary.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say it's not necessary because, people hear that and they're like, "Oh, I need to know apologetics to be
Right.
a Christian," right? And
That's
that's a whole like you go to Romans where it says that Holy Spirit is our inner witness in our spirit confirming the truth of the gospel. So that's the only reason why I don't say necessary, but I agree. If I could like emphasize that as much as possible close
yeah.
to necessary, I would. But I do want to clarify actually something that I said in the last episode, and I didn't have time in the moment. But when we were talking about faith and or reason and feelings,
Mhm.
and I said um, reason and feelings are one. I could easily see how people took that and twisted it in the wrong way. So I just want to clarify what I meant, and it's relevant to these 6 reasons. Um, what I meant was, and you did this for me right after. You said they're both filters, which is good. My point was they're filters, but reason should be ahead of feelings. So it
Mhm.
shouldn't be equal grounds. It should be reason first, because what is true is not determined by what we feel about it, right? I could be falling from a building. Despite how sincerely I want to float, I will not float
Right.
because
Right.
logic tells me that in the law of gravity.
Yep.
Um, and that goes into a whole thing of faith and reason, right? And I think you laid it out that you come to God first, and then you have your reasons, and you seek your
Yeah.
reasons. And plenty of church fathers have held that, like Augustine, I think.
Yep.
My view would be slightly different, but it's still along the same lines in that God has designed our minds for reason to seek him. So it's like a tool, like a handmaiden. And Thomas Aquinas had this view.
Yep.
So my whole point of that was they're one in the sense of filters, but reason should be ahead of feelings, or else we fall in this trap of where we are today.
And I would agree with that wholeheartedly. The way I learned it was that, you have, and I think I kind of use my hand as like,
Yes, yeah.
a lot of people go through all these different filters, and then they get to God, and they use all these filters for like their reason of what they think of God. When
Yes.
instead we need to go from, hey, who we know God to be, and allow Him to explain all these things. The way I learned it though was that reason is the first filter, and then it's experience, and then it's tradition, and feelings and emotions are actually the last one.
Oh,
So they're
perfect.
they're
Okay.
the final thing. That's the way that I learned it.
Yeah,
Um,
so that's more aligned with, and just to clear the other side of that. So I don't think you're on this side, but the other side of that is like a lot of church fathers held that our reasoning is so sinful and corrupted that we need God to show up first in order for us to reason correctly. I find flaws with that view, just because, again, I think reason is more of a tool that was designed for. But
God gave us
when
a
I,
brain, you know,
right, yeah, it gave us a brain to seek him. It could be perverted, right? I could pervert it to seek myself, and that's exactly where you were going,
and
was
that's because of all
self-centered.
the other things, and that's because of
And
yeah,
that's where, to loop it all back to the conversation, that's where these 6 reasons come from. That's why I'm bringing this up.
yep,
Isolationism, who is that about? It's about me. Shallowness, who's that about? Me. Anti-science, I mean, that's kind of about me, right? I'm feeling that it's
right,
incompatible, even though
right,
that might not be the truth. Sex, me. Exclusivity, me. Doubting, me. It's all self-centered instead of reason, or you're not reasoning through that. So that was my whole spiel just to get to that point.
I'll also say this, and then we can move on. The
Yeah.
exclusivity piece, because we didn't talk about it enough. I
Mm,
think that has been, um, I think that's something that's huge. That is less of a thing now, but for a long time, I think, and I think in certain, I think it's not something we do publicly. We don't publicly exclude people.
right.
But I think it's something that privately, in a community aspect, which is something the church operates as, is a community. I think if we're not careful, that it does a lot. And it's, well, I have to, we've all heard the thing of, believe, become, belong, or what, or whatever order you want to put it in. But
Yeah.
there are so many people that feel like they don't belong until they believe, or they don't
Uh,
belong until they've become, or whatever order they want to do it in. But people feel like they can't belong until
mm,
whatever comes prior to that. Where we look at the Bible and we see Jesus was somebody who was magnetic to sinners and Christians. Oh, actually, sinners and his followers alike. All the religious people couldn't stand him. And so I feel like Jesus allowed people to feel like they belonged before they ever believed in him. So that was just. But I
that,
do think that is one where if we're not careful, it becomes a thing.
right. That's a great point, right? Because if you're not careful, then they feel like they're part of it without adopting that biblical worldview, which is the
Exactly.
4% that we mentioned last time, who
Which is
only
also
have.
something that I'm going to get into as we go on here. So.
Good. So let's just get to it. What I wanted to ask you as a follow up to that was, how have you in particular been intentional about keeping the youth engaged, not only in church, right? Because the whole topic we're talking about is engaged in following God's ways, having a biblical worldview. How have you been doing that?
Yeah. So that has actually been something that as long as I can remember, it's been something that's been at the forefront of my mind, and it's something that I always go into like the approach of, you know, doing when I'm preaching to students, when I'm hanging out with students, as I'm thinking about developing students and discipling students. It's always something at the forefront of my mind is training them from that biblical worldview. But it's only something that in the recent months has been something that's been like heavy on me of like, oh, this is a problem and this is the focus. Like for me, it's become the focus over the past probably 2, 3, maybe even 4 months. It's been the thing where I'm like, okay, the worldview and it's almost been like my task, like in the background of like, I want people to become great followers of Jesus. But to me, it's almost been that thing of the goal of that, or the avenue of how to get students there, is almost like if you can shift their worldview to be biblical, then everything else begins to fall in place. Not they're going to be perfect, not they're going to do everything right, but I feel like the pursuit of their relationship with Jesus becomes more pure, and it becomes a little bit easier, and it becomes to feel a little bit more natural because their lens and their filter that they view life through becomes one that's biblical. And so for me, the approach for me has been all like Romans 2, Colossians 2, 1 Corinthians 2, all it pretty much anything Paul wrote with a 2 in front of it, like the second book of anything Paul wrote. That's kind of my
Yeah.
approach. But
Yeah.
no, like Romans 2, we see like, he says, don't be conformed to this world, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And First Corinthians 2, he talks about transforming your mind to be in line with Christ, and in Colossians 2, he says don't get caught up with different translations say it different ways, but like philosophies, all these different philosophies that the world has. Takes captive thoughts through hollow and deceptive philosophies that are based on human tradition and on elemental spiritual forces and all these different things. So like that has been my approach of that has to be the focus of don't get caught up, don't get sucked in, don't be conformed to everything else. And so for me it's a process, like it becomes more than just like this thing of like correcting worldview is something that it takes almost as long to correct it as it took for them to adopt it.
Right.
And so you have to look at like how long are the formative years of a student, right? Like where does it really start? Does it start in middle school? Does it start when they were in fourth, fifth grade and they started having their own ideas? You know what I mean? And not just like things that their parents had started to instill in them, but they're like, oh, I'm starting to understand like my idea of how the world works. Like, and I don't know that I have the answer to that question nailed down. Maybe I need to research that a little bit more of when do students begin to really adopt their own mindsets and things like that. Um, but it's a process, and it's unbinding and reversing the narrative that they've come to believe over time. And much like our walk with Jesus, when you know we experience salvation and make Jesus the Lord of our life, that starts a process with us of, reversing, hey, you've learned and lived all of this way. Now we're going to start the process of learning to live a different way. And I think it's a very similar thing, of beginning to unbind and reverse and reteach this narrative of, hey, this is how the world showed you how to view life, and how to view your beliefs and your morals and your ethics, and your values and your behaviors. But here's how the Bible does it. And so it's a process that happens over time. And for me, there's a few things that for me are like ground rules for it, and that's kindness, compassion, patience. Right. And to me, that's part of it. With especially with the next generation, we've talked. And I keep bringing it up as, a core belief that they have come to learn is if you attack my behavior, if you attack my mindset, if you attack my attitude, then you're attacking my identity. And so for me to unbind their identity from their behaviors and from their beliefs, and from, well, not from their beliefs, but from their behavior and from their attitude and from their mindset, um, to begin to do that process of really like separating those things from each other, it takes time. It takes time, and so it takes patience. And as the walk happens, we can't expect them to just understand it all at once. And so that has been kind of my process and my avenue for it. Is as we teach the Bible, it's always I always try to attack it from what is the goal that we're trying to get to, or what's the problem that we're trying to address. And so I'm always looking at what's a piece of their worldview, what's something that they've come to adopt as something that's a part of the culture, because culture is all they've ever known. Culture, we always are like, culture changes, but to them, they've just always been a part of it. So they're like, this is
Right.
all I know. And so how do I approach that, of how you call it out and how do you address it, but also how do you replace it with something that shows, hey, this is what the Bible has to say about that, or hey, this is the way that Jesus had intended for that to look in our lives. And so it's never just cleaning house. It's always making sure to replace it with a biblical perspective of that worldview.
So good. And you said two things that stood out to me. I love that you focused on the scriptural verses about renewing your mind and about transforming your mind. That's reason, right? Like that's addressing
Right.
the reasoning faculties of your students, because you could flip it and you could say, "Oh, well, just have more faith, student who
Right.
has doubts, or have
Yeah.
more faith, student who thinks the church is too exclusive." And they're going to walk away like,
Yep.
"Okay, I'm just going to leave the church because what does that mean?"
And I've talked to so many students who, or are on the verge of giving up, or they're done with their mom's church or their dad's church or whatever. And this is not to slander other churches,
Right.
but it is to say, like, there are a lot of things where up to this point the advice given, or the roadmap or avenue to get there is, well, have you prayed? Have you prayed about it?
Mm,
And students, they're like, I don't know how me just praying about it is going to just change everything that I've believed and learned to live up to this point. And so,
right.
it's not putting something practical in their hands. Yes, prayer does work, but if they don't even know where their mindset is flawed and wrong, because that hasn't been exposed to the truth of Scripture, then they don't even know what to be praying for to be corrected. Um,
Wow.
and so,
It's a great point. That's so true. Yeah, they need more reasoning, and that's why I love the fact that you do that. You have that top of mind. The other thing you said, which I just thought was a really interesting question that you raised, is when do students get their worldview figured out? I'm sure there's an age out there. I'm sure sociologists have figured that out,
yeah,
but I think it gets a little more complex in this day and age. And I
yeah,
say that because we're having a lot more dad and dads and mom and moms. So right out of the gate, you
they're learning.
have, yeah, right out of the gate, right out of the womb, you have homosexual parents. So these kids are thinking this is normal,
Hmm.
but not according to God's design. So it's like right away, you could say at a certain age they're conscious enough to understand that, but I think it goes way deeper than that. You're subconsciously planting these ideas and these values in their head. So
And
it's
that's a
almost
lot of
like,
where worldview comes from. So, I mean, I would
right.
even argue the age. You could argue the age is 7, where
Yeah.
things really become to be this thing where, the world around them becomes comprehensible to their mindset of how they believe the world operates around them.
Mm.
And so, and so it could be I would even argue maybe it is as early as 7 on a sociological and psychological side of things. That's how we look at generate. That's how a lot of, I don't do the research for this, but from what I've seen, that's how a lot of people gauge generations is, a lot of people are gauged as millennials because were you old enough and in your formative years for 9/11 to have a lasting impact on your life and the way you view the world around you? And if the answer to that can be yes, they say a lot of people, the age for them is around 6 or 7 years old, where you can understand, you can watch that on TV and understand what that means. Not just be like, oh my gosh, that was scary, but to say the world is dangerous and the things around me, there is no safety. And, and to begin to have like those kinds of concepts that are downloaded into your subconscious, like you said, at a sub level, not at this thing where it's, but just this thing that runs in the background of your belief that begins to get created and formed at that time. So I would even argue as low as 7, as young
Yeah.
as 6 or 7, um, is where worldview, where you're able to start downloading information that you see in the world around you, and that you hear people tell you and whatever, and to begin to believe that as this is how the world works, this is how the world was created, this is how it's supposed to be, this is normal, this is acceptable, and begin to adopt those as mindsets and values.
So good. And that's Romans 1, right? When he talks about homosexuality and all these different, sins and anger and lust and all that. And he's making an argument from design, which is why I always go to Romans 1 for
Right.
any, sexuality verse, because he's saying it's the unnatural. We're
Mhm.
taking what is natural and we're making it unnatural. And that's truth over feelings. That's
Yep.
exactly your point. So just to summarize how you would answer that, for our listeners, for myself as well, correct me if I'm wrong, you would say that the way you're going about this is mainly intentionality. You're being
100.
intentional in the way that you lead your flock of students, which is spot on. Would you say that's correct?
I would agree 100%. Yep. And it's
Awesome.
intentionality. It's replacing truth with, and where it is he says it in Romans. I believe it's Romans 1, or it's later on in Romans 2 after he says that we've traded the truth of God's word for a lie.
I believe
And
that's
so I'm
Romans
trying
1. Yeah.
I'm trying to undo that, and my goal is how do we undo that?
Mm.
One thing at a time, right? Don't and you can't try and fix when we view, and you said it earlier too, and I love the way you said it because you immediately were like, that's not the goal. Is we're not trying to fix people. They're not a problem to be fixed. They're people to be cared for.
Mm.
And so it's not how do you fix them all at once? How do you get all the things figured out? It's more of a thing of how do you take one thing at a time, one day at a time, and begin to dissect that worldview and say, hey, that's a truth that has been replaced with a lie. Let's do the inverse of that. Let's take that lie and replace it with the truth of Scripture.
Right, because the fixing came from the blood of Christ, right?
Mhm.
The fixing is the justification. The caring for that you mentioned is us, is the sanctification,
Yes.
is us helping them, is us loving them. And that's what I wanted to mention earlier with those 6 reasons. A lot of kids, I think, and you might be able to attest to this, they look at the rules, quote unquote, in scripture and they say, oh, there's so many rules to follow.
Right,
Well, these rules are exactly what leads to human flourishing.
right.
And if you follow those ways, both believer and non-believer alike, you will flourish in how you were designed. If you don't follow those ways, you will fall into destruction. So like teaching them that the purpose of life is not your pleasure, but
Mhm.
to fulfill what you were designed to do, which is to seek, love, and worship him.
And from
Um,
that, you will gain
right.
more than you could. And so there's a study that was done. I don't know if you've ever seen this article. They took children on a playground, like elementary school students on a playground. And what they did, like the playground was out on the side of the school. There was like, whatever different like side roads and all, just like by a neighborhood or whatever. And they took the kids out and they built this playground, put a fence around it, right? And they told the students you can play anywhere inside the fence. And what they found is that students would go all the way up to the fence line to play. They would play tag, they would, do all kinds of things. They would roam the entire playground. And what they did was they removed um, the fence from the playground and they released one day. They didn't tell the students, they just released them back out. And what they found is that the kids only hung out by the playground equipment, like by like the wood chips. Kids were not running around in the open field. Kids were not running around like on the pavement and playing kickball. They like stayed in the middle. They
Wow.
stayed like cowered in the middle almost.
Hmm.
And so what they found is that like the boundary was not something that gave them restriction. The boundary was something that gave them freedom. And so, they were able to know where the line is and to play within the lines, and they knew the boundaries kept them safe. But when there was nothing, there was no vision for them to follow. And, the Bible says where there's no vision, the people perish. And I think it's the same thing is we just need to show students that like playing inside the boundaries, inside the fences that God has created is where you can flourish and live inside of his best. Not that the rules were created to harm you. They were created to help you. Um, in the garden, there was only one rule. That was it. So God's
Right.
design, and what I tell students is God's design and intent for our life was to give us as much freedom as we possibly can have. We messed that up. That wasn't him.
Mhm.
His intention was, I want you to have as little amount of rules as possible. He had one. Don't eat of that fruit of that tree. And that was it. He said, you can do whatever else you want. God didn't say it like this, but he was like, I don't care what you do, just don't do that one thing. And so
Right.
God's initial design was, how can I get as little amount of rules on the table and give them as much freedom as possible to live within all that I've given them? And so that's the kind of perspective I'm trying to download into students is the rules are not meant to harm you. They're meant to give you freedom and a boundary and a place to play inside where you can flourish and live inside of those fences.
So good. That is a perfect segue into the next question of now we focused on you and you in particular. Let's broaden out, so to
Right?
speak. And what are some ways that you think the Big C church can go about keeping, again, not just inviting more Christians, but keeping
Right.
Christians, especially the youth, in a biblical worldview, following God's ways?
Right. Um, Go with me here. Maybe a little, maybe you're going to be like immediately in agreement, or maybe you're going to be like, you're going to have to explain this one to me a little bit.
All
Um,
right.
but I heard from somebody one time that I think like, um, okay, so I'll start on it. I'll get into it a little bit different. So Paul says like, I'll do anything short of sin to see those far from Christ come to know him and his love and glory. I'm a big believer in that. And so I think, I'm not going to do anything. I also am kind of, I'm not as crazy on that as some other people are. Some people are like, let's do wild things.
Yeah.
I still try and keep it kind of like, all right, this is reasonable and I'm comfortable. Um, but I am this thing of what can we do that piques the interest of Gen Z and Gen Alpha? What can we do that's going to make them want to come through the doors? What can we do that's going to engage their interests on their level, even if it has nothing to do with church? But is it something that if they, and we go back to these six things that we talked about, the inclusivity piece, the judgmental piece, the shallowness piece, the isolation piece. It's like, how can we show them that the church is a place that's meant to be inviting, that's meant to be inclusive, that's meant to be welcoming, that's meant to be deep, that's meant to be like the local church is designed to be the hope of the world. And so it's like, what can we do that's anything short of sin to get them in the door? Can we be inviting? Can we, I don't care if we're, with my students even, it's, hey, what food can I offer? You know what I mean? And it's like, well, that's tricking them to get in the door. But listen, there's nothing wrong with someone coming and expecting a donut, and
Hmm.
and finding the Holy Spirit. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
to me, that's a win. That's an absolute win. And so it's like, how can we pique the interest of them? Whether it's through a place of, um, you know, love, or it's through a place of something that we bring to the table that nobody else is doing. What can we do to pique their interest just so they can hear the word? I think for so long we're telling people come and hear. Hey, come and hear all that God's doing, but they're like, that place is, I'm not going there. That looks like
Right.
not a place that has nothing of interest to me. And so it is that thing of what does it look like to begin to accept and even adopt some of the process. And I think this is where maybe our church gets in a little bit of trouble with this from other churches, or just from the way people view us. People look at our church and they may say, well, you go to that progressive church, you go to that other place. And it's like, we may be progressive and this is where I'm saying, what does this look like? Just to be progressive in your methodology, but to be completely set we are not progressive at all in our theology and in our doctrinal statements. Like everything we believe is just like is straight from the Bible. Is what the Bible says. We follow what the Bible says. But it's, hey, in your methodology of getting people in the door, we may be progressive in that. We do use electric guitars, and we use lights, and we use different things, and we use a touch screen when pastors preach, and all kinds of different things. But I go back to that thing, and this is where I didn't jump in right here, but kind of like this dispensationalism mindset that in different times God will use different methods to reach different people in different ways. And I know that's a little bit of a I know that's a little bit of a misconstrued of the direct definition of dispensationalism, but the idea that in different times there are different people that God wants to reach in a different way through different light. And I would urge people to just be open to that. That we live, the year 20, what year is it? 2025 is very different than the year even like 1990. Just at what's available to us to be able to reach people. And so what does it look like for us to be open to, maybe God didn't, give us this technology or the brilliant minds that have created this technology for us to shun it and say it's bad and don't do that and it's from the devil, but to use it because that's what the generation is using. That's part of the experience for them. And so if we want to get them in, we need to be able to speak their language. We need to be able to use their things, their technology, their whatever, and in a way is that works for them, that they can receive it and say, wow, this is something for me. They use that thing that I use. They say that thing that I say. They do that thing that I do. That's part of what my generation has grown up and adopted doing. You know, that's just a little bit of the way.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think I like how you phrase that, right? Because there's a blurred line, and I could see where people could be
Yep.
like, wow. Like, but I think you explained it very clear and well. And I know our church is not progressive in our theology. I'm glad you clarified that, but we
Yeah.
are not. We are
I
very
think
biblical.
sometimes people see the outside,
Yes.
or they see, maybe not even the outside, but they see like a video of whatever, of worship, and there's LED lights everywhere, and there's electric guitars, and it's like, and it's all this stuff, and they're like, oh, they're that progressive church. And
Right.
so I always try and make sure it's not misconstrued, of like, you can be progressive in your methods without being progressive in your theology.
That's good. And my stance on that is similar to yours, right? I think, and Paul said, I can be all things to
Yep.
everybody, or something to that effect.
Yep.
And I think that's what you were referencing. Um, but what you said when you first started, you said one word that I think is so key, and you said within reason, or being reasonable. So,
Yeah.
like, having this idea of being all things to all people within reason, right? Like, we're not going to go do something explicit to bring in people to the church
Short
because we
sin.
know
I think
that's
Paul
a
used
little wild.
that sin. Yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing I think is important for people to know, and churches really at the Big C Church,
Yep.
is it's good to bring them in, but the goal is to keep them in,
Right.
right? So and I don't think any of the tactics at our church does this. I don't think they're shallow enough to bring in and then have them leave.
Right.
But as you know, some churches, they go even crazier with their methods to go out and get people in, to the point where you are confused as to whether it's a church or a club.
All right. I'm just gonna say this, not subtweeting anybody. I
Yeah.
mean, I kind of am. I'm not saying any names. All right.
Okay.
Hey, anybody watching, if you thought of this, if you thought of a specific person, church, whatever, that's on you. I didn't say it. All right.
Okay.
But even like Easter's close, right? We're in the springtime.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's a lot of churches. I see their Easter spectaculars or whatever they're calling
Yeah.
them, and I just kind of am like, I've seen, you see all over Instagram, all over TikTok, all over wherever, all these different churches Easter thing, and I look at some of them and I'm like, we are pushing the bar, like
Yeah.
to an uncomfortable degree, to where I'm like, this. I know it's not heresy, but it feels like it is because of what I'm seeing. Like, do you know what I
Mm.
mean? Like,
Yes. Well,
it's
that's like, and I'll call it out, Transformation Church,
right.
Pastor Mike Todd. I don't care. uh, you know, I think what they have done is a little excessive, and it's excessive because, and they'll say, right? They'll say, oh, well, you didn't listen to the whole thing. You didn't listen to it in context. Fair. But what I saw is what I saw. And then the excuse is, well, we're going to do everything short of sin to get them in the door. Again, fair, but are you keeping them in the door? Are they going there for a rap concert, or are they going there to experience God and worship him, not serve themselves? And that's, again, it comes back to that. Are we serving ourselves, or are we serving him?
Right.
And
And to me, the question of, do you lose some other people?
mm,
Are you becoming a stumbling block now to some of your other people? And the other thing is this, and here's where I give the grace, is not everything is for everybody, right?
yes,
Somebody may have needed that, right? And there may be some person who's a holier than thou um Pharisee in the room who just is going, this is whatever, this is heresy, and I can't, you know what I mean? Like, and so it's like, at the end of the day, not everything is going to be for everyone.
yeah,
Um and that's why so many different churches are necessary. But it is hard because it's like, where do you, is there a line that gets drawn, and where do you draw that line?
right.
You know?
And I think if we, as a Big C church, have our scope set on not only bringing them in the door, but keeping them in the door. So this is discipleship, right? It's so easy to just aim for the hands raised at the altar call, right? That's what we're doing it for. And then we have numbers and we show it off, and it means a lot. Those are great metrics to have. But we have to keep them, because as Jesus said, at the parable, the seeds will fall and they will be taken away if we don't grow them, and we don't grow them and garden. So we need to disciple these people. And I don't think the somewhat sketchy, outside the lines methods is what's going to keep them, but it will attract them.
Yes. And you
And
do need something to get people in the door, you know?
yes, get them in the door. And then, even if it's like, listen, we do this because we want to show you that church is not something to be afraid of,
Right.
but we come here not for you. We come here as a body collectively for him.
Yep.
So this music is not for you. This food, this donut, it might seem like it's for you, but it's not for you. It's
Right.
for you to worship and know him. Right?
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
So
Hey, we
that's,
we gave you a
yes,
treat on the way in just to say we appreciate you. Thank you for being here.
right,
We do want you to come and see and hear and you know, come hear the word. You know what I mean?
right,
But this may have got you through the door, but that's not why we're here. We're not here to eat donuts, and we're not just here to impress you. You know, it's all that stuff. Uh,
right,
Two things that came to mind as we're talking about this is, I look at Jesus in the Bible, and somebody one time laid it out for me that his method and his mission could not have looked more different. And we see it played out in the way that Jesus talks about himself and the way that the Pharisees talked about him. Jesus says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost," right? And that's still the goal, and that's still what all of us are chasing. Is that it? And it follows that Great Commission: go and and spread the good news to all the ends of the earth, baptizing them in the name of, telling them of the good news. Creating new followers of Jesus through his grace and being able for us to present them the word. And then baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and creating disciples among all the nations. Um, and and So we see that Jesus says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and save that which is lost." That's what Jesus said his mission was.
right,
And so we see the mission because it comes straight from Jesus' mouth. Here's why I'm here.
yeah,
But we see the method of Jesus looks vastly different because we see his method played out from the perspective of the Pharisees. And he says, "Who is this?" And so, and we notice it because both times he's referred to as, "Who is this Son of Man?" So he says, "Well, this Son of Man came to seek and save that which is lost." And the Pharisees look at him and they go, "Who is this Son of Man who we see eating and drinking amongst sinners?" And that's what they saw. And so, it becomes this thing of the perspective and the way that we view it and look at it is, they saw somebody eating and drinking amongst sinners, and doing things that by the standard of the holy people, was unacceptable. We don't associate with those people. We don't do it that way. We don't go to those lengths. We don't talk to those, whatever it might have been. And what they saw was him eating and drinking amongst sinners. But what he was doing was creating the environment for him to seek and save the lost. And I think for us, if we're not careful as the church, we can make something monstrous out of something that is evangelistic, um,
right,
of reaching people. That being an open door, finding a way to be an open door, finding a way to be inclusive and inviting to somebody who has never been to church and who maybe has been hurt by the church or this, that, or the next thing. Being able to find a way that says, other people may view it and go, "Who are these people eating and drinking amongst sinners?" But to us, we're saying we're doing whatever we can to line up Jesus to seek and save the lost.
right. And
And
that's,
so,
Yeah. No, I don't mean to cut you off, but I think that's exactly what it's
Yep.
all about. And it goes back to your point of intentionality.
Yep.
What is your intentions?
Yep.
So that's so good. We are coming up now, but I do have other questions to ask you in the last 10 minutes or so that we have. And I
Absolutely.
do want to pivot. So we talked about the church, right? The local church and the big C church. Now, what I'm finding, my belief is that, and I think this is substantial, is one of the reasons for the lack of a biblical worldview in the next generation and the hopelessness and fearfulness that we're seeing, like we talked about in part one,
Right.
is the parenting, right? This
Right.
starts in the house. It starts with the parents. You could blame the church all you want, but mom and dad are those first layers
Right.
of discipleship. That's
Mm.
your ministry as parents. I have a 1-year-old and a son on the way. That's my ministry. This
Right.
Truthful Hope is what I'm doing.
Right.
It is nothing if I don't have a good ministry at home.
Right.
And that's straight from Paul. So how can parents, from your experience, you don't have to speak for everything that you haven't experienced, but from
Mhm.
what you've seen, how can parents do a better job raising their children in the faith given the threats that they face in the culture?
Yeah. That's a great question, and I'm just going to say this right now. I'm not sure that I have the perfect answer for this because I'm not a parent. I'm not
Fair.
yet a parent. Not at the time of recording this podcast. I am
Right.
not. Um, but I will say this because I do work with a lot of parents. I have a lot of parents around me who support me and support my ministry, and I view myself as an extension of a family. I'm not a student's parent, and so I can't do it for them. But I do look at myself as I partner with families. I partner with parents who are raising their kids in the faith. And so I do have a perspective on it. And so I need to put that disclaimer out there as I'm not a parent,
Yeah.
so I don't have the answer. But as somebody who stands alongside parents in helping students on a daily and weekly basis, I think one thing to do is the most important thing, and this is part of my whole life has become this idea of like we have to model it. We have to and I think the most important thing is that we have to it's two things. We have to model it and we have to fight for it.
Mm.
Um, because there will come a day where your students' faith will have to be their own. Whether that's when they graduate, whether that's when they hit a point where they're gone at summer camp and they don't have you to lean on and your wisdom and your words and your faith. That there comes a time in everybody's life, in every student's life and every child's life, when parents are trying to raise their kids in the faith, where that faith can no longer be clipped to yours. You know what I mean? Where it's no longer a tether, and their faith has to become their own. And so if we're going to do that well, we have to model it. We have to model it as student leaders and as parents of students. We have to model it well, and so be be the model that you want your student to see. If you're trying to teach them biblical worldview, students view everything in the context of culture and what culture is teaching them and showing them around them. And culture is not something that is taught. Culture is something that is caught, and so we have to be able to model it so that they can catch it. Because we know because I'm sure as parents and as leaders and as people who work with students all the time, we say it is like do as I don't do what I say, do as I do, or you know what I mean. It's like we're always telling them like it's not about the words, it's about the actions, it's about this and that. Um, but we can tell them something 1,000 times. We can tell them something over and over again. But if they don't see us living that and living it like we believe it and like it's the truth that we hold to, then they're just going to deposit us into one of those six categories from the beginning: that it's disingenuine, that they're alone, that it's not modeled, that it's shallow, and they're going to that's the conclusion they're going to come to. Is one of the conclusions that have already happened is they're going to start to doubt it. They're going to start to think it's shallow. They're going to start to think it's disingenuine and it's uninviting, and a lot of those things are going to be the conclusion they come to because we didn't model it well. So that's one part of it. And then the second part, I'll just say real quick, and then Jake, I'd love to hear uh, your thoughts on this. Is I think we have a generation who is begging silently for us to fight for them, and Pastor Kenneth, my pastor, has talked about this before. that and Pastor Chris Hodges down at Church of the Highlands, he preached on this one time, and they have an amazing student ministry with thousands, literally thousands of students, and they did a survey. So the point of his message came from this survey they do every year, from students. And one of the things that popped up a lot is, I just want my parents to, I wish my dad would do this. I wish my mom would act like this. And a lot of it, and I can't quote it directly, but a lot of it came back to, I wish my dad would, would when I do this, I just wish my parents would call me out on it. Or, I wish my parents weren't afraid to hold me accountable for different things. And so this silent cry that if they would have never done this poll, we would have never found this to be this thing that's happening silently inside of the generation, that they're looking for parents and leaders and people and mentors and just people to follow, who they follow in their life, to fight for them on their behalf, and saying, hey, I'm fighting right alongside of you. You can do it as well. And so, I just urge us, will we be a generation that fights for our students? And I said this last week, but one of the scariest verses for me in the Bible is I think it's Judges 2:10. It says, "And there grew a generation that did not know the Lord and His mighty works." And so what would it look like if we fought, and our goal and our mindset became, how do we make sure this is not the story that we tell for this next generation, that it's modeled well, that it's taught well, that issues are confronted. And maybe that's another thing, is that in the household, as we raise them, that as things begin to come up, as uncomfortable as conversations may be, and as much as it's like, hey, I don't want to have to be the one to have this conversation, that there is merit to something. There's a rule, it's called the law of first mention, and that whoever
Right.
gets the first say on it gets to set the principle and the boundary and the standard for what that thing looks like as truth in their life. So what if we were the first ones who get to talk to them and have the talk, right? And get to have that talk about sex and sexuality with them? What if we're the first ones who get to talk to them about science and all those things? What if we're the first one who gets to talk about pride and envy and greed and jealousy? What if we were the ones to have the first mention of that from a biblical standard, and then to be able to model it to back up what we've taught them as truth? I think there's just something so powerful about that.
Right, because if you don't, someone else will. And
Someone
that
else
someone
will.
else will not have a Christian worldview. So you're giving your kids up to
Right.
someone foreign, to a
So
foreign worldview.
exactly. And so the question becomes, who do you want to be the one teaching your child about
Right.
sexuality and about relativism and about evolution and about all these things? Do you want to be the first one to mention that to them, and to be able to say, hey, I have monopolized the principle and the standard that this household believes? Or do you want it to be their friend in fifth grade, or their teacher in seventh grade, or maybe depending on their upbringing, they have to wait all the way till they get to college, and they're sitting for some reason in a gender studies class, and now that person gets to set the standard for what that looks like in their life,
Right.
because
And
we didn't tackle it.
right. And you hit the nail on the head. That was that whole thing. I know you're not a parent yet, but you're going to make a great parent, because that was right on the money.
Thanks. I hope.
Um, That's exactly what we want to do. And what you said was the only input I was going to add was have the difficult conversations. And that's something I'm preparing myself for. And we all should prepare ourselves for.
Yep.
There's no room to say, oh, well, I don't know how I'm going to answer that. Well, you should know how to answer that, or you should prepare yourself now to answer that question, because it'll dictate how they behave in the world.
Yep.
And it's your responsibility, right? So,
I'll also say this, and let me just encourage all the parents out there with this:
yeah.
is is as somebody who's had those conversations a handful of times with multiple different students, I don't even know that at this point in my life that it makes it more fun or easier, or like, yeah, I love this. Like, it's my favorite part of the job, like having this real uncomfortable conversation. You do get better at how to say it. But it's never the most comfortable thing that I do all day, is like, can't wait to set the standard for this student on sex and human sexuality. But it's like, yes, there's a little bit of uncomfortability in there. But at the same time, I love that I get to do this,
Right.
because I believe it just is that important. It just is.
Well, it goes back to faith as being best defined in Scripture as trusting in what you have good reasons to believe.
Right.
Now, we should have good reasons for what we believe with everything. We should
Right.
have faith, true active trust. And if you hold a stance of, marriage is between a man and a woman, and you want to teach your kids that, you should have good reasons
and
that
basis of that faith and of that
right,
belief.
to hold that and then communicate that clearly to them so
Yep.
they too can have that reason. But if you have no reasons for that belief, why would they believe you? And then
Yep.
someone else is going to come in from a different worldview, maybe more of a progressive, left leaning one,
Yep.
and they're going to give what seems like great reasons, but all they have is filters of the filter of feelings that we mentioned before. So
Or
I,
of experience and tradition. We have the Methodist Church, which has begun to adopt a lot of these same-sex marriages and relationships within leadership in the church, and all these different things. And the Catholic Church that has adopted all of these beliefs about baptism, and just so many different things. And with all the best intention in the world, what happens when your student goes somewhere and learns something that the Bible never said, but they learned it from a church? And so now there's all this confusion because we were never able to set the standard and set the bar from the beginning. So I think it's so
right.
important.
So good. Now, so we're at the hour mark, but I want to add this last question,
Absolutely.
because I think it's important, and maybe this will be a great ending point for the parents as well. Imagine there's a 14-year-old girl listening to this episode
Hmm.
and claims to be a Christian, but she is really wrestling with biblical principles.
Right.
The homosexuality is a temptation for her, and transgenderism is big, and she's just really struggling with all those 6 reasons. Now, what would you say to her as a starting point? Obviously, you could say a lot, right? But what would be your starting point in that conversation?
Absolutely. A 14-year-old, and maybe this is for that person who's watching this right now, or maybe it's for the parent who has this student at home, or the parent that will have this student at home at one point. And I just, to me, I always start here. Is, hey, you're wrestling through these things. You're struggling with grasping it. And I always start with this: is that's okay. The Bible will challenge you. The Bible will challenge your perspective. The Bible will challenge your belief. The Bible will challenge your worldview. And so I would start with this, and there is a comma and a dash and a continuation of this sentence. But hey, that is okay to be challenged. It is okay to be challenged at some point in our soul and at a spiritual level. All of us, every single one of us, myself, Jake, your parents, the parent on the other side of this camera, have struggled and wrestled with different things that the Bible speaks and says. And I even think of Jacob in the Bible, who wrestled with God physically, and he says, I will not leave until you bless me. I will not leave until something changes. And I would just, and here's where the comma on that sentence is, it's okay to struggle and to wrestle with these things, but we must struggle and wrestle until we get to the other side of it. We must struggle and wrestle and pray and ask God, would you clarify these things to me? And hey, I'm not going to be satisfied until this, from a biblical wisdom perspective, is set in my heart. And so that's my encouragement on the front end. I don't know, and again, like you said, I don't have all the answers, because that could go with so many different things, or what the topic of the struggle is, or whatever. But the Bible is meant to challenge us. The Bible is a roadmap, and as we talked about earlier with just the intentionality piece, the Bible is a roadmap to help rewire and rewrite all of the worldview that we've learned over time. And so it's okay that you're struggling and challenged and wrestling through those things, but it's a process we must get to the other side of. We have to wrestle through with it until we are on the other side of it, until we have completed the wrestling and grabbed the biblical truth out of it.
So good. It's a
Yeah.
great starting point. Now,
Yeah.
that conversation could go into a million different directions, but I think that is
Absolutely.
a solid starting point because it invites the conversation, and that's what we want. We want to
It should
start right. We
it
want to
should be
open
like
them up, invite them to conversate. So
yeah.
that is awesome. Pastor Lucas, we are at time now, but that was such an incredible conversation. I think it was really helpful. I hope our listeners find it insightful, helpful to get them starting to see what we need to do as a church, as
I hope
parents.
it's practical. I hope
Yeah,
it's applicable to wherever you're at in your life, and as a parent or as somebody who may work with students or even have a passion for the next generation, just to be able to know, hey, where's the starting point for us?
Right. Totally. And I am looking forward to having you on again. We have so much more to talk about a whole bunch of things. Maybe we'll have that science and faith conversation another
Yeah,
time.
maybe we can do that another time, or maybe I can be a fly on the wall with an actual expert. So
That sounds good. Well, Pastor Lucas, thank you so much for joining. We
thank you for
appreciate you
having me.
being on, of course. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. Tune in next time. God bless.